History is the base on which our present world stands. If even one small event from 300 years ago were changed, today's world would be completely different. Now imagine this. What if one man travels 500 years into the past and changes something important? The future would collapse. Small changes would create huge disasters. But how did this all start? And can everything be fixed again? Get ready for a thrilling time travel story. The story begins with Dan, a facility manager who works as an assistant in a university science lab. One day, just like always, Dan leaves work early in a hurry. A history professor named Chris notices this and scolds him. Chris warns Dan that if he keeps leaving early, he will complain to higher authorities and Dan could lose his job. Dan quickly apologizes and rushes away. Dan drives outside the town of Lexington. A signboard says the town was established in 1713, and in 2025, its population is 31,000. Why is Dan in such a rush? And why is this town so important? Dan reaches a deserted area, takes out a strange device, and climbs into a pit. Suddenly, there is a blast, and reality around him starts breaking, as if time itself is changing. When Dan comes out, his clothes are different. The town's signboard has changed too. The population now reads 768. This means Dan has traveled back in time, from 2025 to 1765. But why did he come here? Dan has been time traveling for the past year. During these trips, he fell in love with a girl named Deborah, who lives in the 18th century. That's why he keeps returning to 1765 to meet her. Deborah doesn't know that Dan is actually from the future. One day while they are together, Dan sees British soldiers and realizes something is wrong. In April 1765, the American Revolution should have started. Americans were supposed to fight the British and gain freedom, but this time, nothing happens. Dan panics. He realizes that by coming to the past again and again, he may have changed history. He rushes back to 2025, and what he sees shocks him. America is still under British rule. British food, British culture, British power, everything is British. History has changed completely. To fix this, Dan goes to Professor Chris, knowing his knowledge of history can help. He takes Chris to his home and shows him the huge time machine hidden in his garage. The machine lets people travel through time using a special bag. At first, Chris doesn't believe him. Time travel sounds impossible, but Dan explains everything: how he traveled to the past, fell in love, and accidentally erased the American Revolution. Chris realizes something strange. He doesn't remember any American Revolution at all. No one does. The timeline has already changed. Dan then shows him an old history book from the original timeline to prove the truth. Dan convinces Chris to come back to the past with him and fix history using the book as a guide. Nervous but curious, Chris agrees. They enter the bag, and in a sudden flash, they travel back in time. When they arrive, Chris is stunned. Dan was telling the truth. They are really in the past. Now they must make sure history happens exactly as it was meant to. Otherwise, America will stay under British rule forever. They change into old-fashioned clothes so no one suspects them. Dan and Chris decide to work together and find the leaders who were supposed to start the fight against the British. On the way, Dan secretly meets Deborah while keeping Chris hidden. That is when Chris finally understands the truth. Dan has been coming to the past only because of Deborah. And because of this, something important in history changed. In the new timeline, the American Revolution never started, and America became a British colony. They continue searching, and by evening, reach a bar. There they meet two men named John and Samuel. These are the same leaders who were supposed to start the rebellion. But in this timeline, they never did. Chris angrily asks everyone why they are not fighting the British. At first, people laugh at him. In that time period, people with dark skin were treated badly, and only white people were respected. Dan steps in and calms everyone down, because the townspeople already know him. Dan has been visiting this town for the past year. He often brings food and water from the future, things that are very rare in this time. Because of this, people respect him a lot, even though they don't know he is from the future. They think he is a rich trader from a nearby town. Sometimes he even brings chocolates, which people have never tasted before. Because of Dan, everyone listens carefully. Dan and Chris ask John and Samuel what they plan to do next against the British. They explain that their main leader, Paul Revere, has not given any orders yet. Without his permission, they cannot fight. They also reveal something shocking. Deborah, the girl Dan loves, is actually Paul Revere's daughter. Chris becomes very angry. Paul Revere is the man who was supposed to start the American Revolution, and Dan is secretly involved with his daughter. This explains why history has changed. Dan and Chris go to meet Paul Revere and ask him why he is not fighting the British. Paul explains that he had arranged Deborah's marriage to a powerful family, but she refused. He also found out that she is secretly meeting a boy. Because of this, Paul says he will first find that boy and kill him, and only after that that will he think about fighting the British. That boy is Dan, though Paul does not know it yet. Dan and Chris now realize the truth. This whole disaster happened because of Dan. By coming to the past again and again to meet Deborah, he distracted Paul Revere. Because Paul was worried about his daughter, he could not focus on the revolution. One small change caused all of history to change. Later, Chris privately scolds Dan. He says everything is Dan's fault and only Dan can fix it. Dan must leave Deborah and never return to the past. If Deborah marries someone else, Paul Revere will focus on the revolution again, and history can finally return to normal. The next morning, Dan meets Deborah again. He doesn't want to leave her because he truly loves her. But for the good of the world, he tells her that she should marry the man her father chose and forget him. He says they can never be together. Deborah refuses to accept this. In her heart, she already thinks of Dan as her husband. She asks him why he suddenly wants to leave. Dan says she might not believe him, but he still tells her the truth. He explains that he is not from her time at all. He is from the future, from the year 2025, and he comes to the past only to meet her. But because he kept coming back, an important event, the American Revolution, never happened, and the future completely changed. To fix everything, he now has to leave her. Dan also tells her about Chris, who was actually a history professor from the future and came with him to repair history. To Dan's surprise, Deborah believes him. She says Dan always felt strange to her. His way of speaking, his words, and the gifts he gave her never seemed normal for their time. Sometimes he talked about things she had never even heard of, so she already suspected that he was not from her world. Dan feels happy hearing this and realizes how smart Deborah is. She had noticed everything long ago but stayed quiet, waiting for him to tell the truth himself. Still, Deborah says she cannot live without Dan. While they are talking, British soldiers suddenly come from behind and capture Chris. In that time, dark-skinned people were not allowed to move freely, and Deborah warns that the soldiers will kill him. Dan quickly jumps on a horse with Deborah and rides to save Chris. Deborah proves she is not only smart but also brave. She takes a shortcut, reaches the soldiers first, fights them, saves Chris, and drives them away. Now Chris understands how good Deborah really is. She saved his life. He tells Dan that Dan was right, and that Dan does not need to leave Deborah to fix history. Chris comes up with a new plan. He says Dan should take Deborah to the future, to the year 2025. In that time, women have more freedom, and Dan and Deborah can live happily together. Chris himself will stay in the past and try to start the American Revolution instead of Deborah's father, Paul. Dan is relieved because he won't lose Deborah. Deborah is excited too, not just because she gets to stay with Dan, but because she will see the future. A future where women are free, diseases are cured, and children do not die from illness. They both enter the time bag, Dan starts the machine, and in one sudden moment, they reach the year 2025. Deborah steps out and is amazed by the tall buildings. She has never seen anything like this before. A world without hunger and full of advanced technology. But then they notice a statue. What they see shocks them. Once again, the American Revolution never happened. America is still under British rule. The statue says that on 24th April, 1765, a man named Chris tried to start a revolution. But because of his dark skin, no one supported him, and he was killed by soldiers. This means that the day after Dan and Deborah left Chris in the past, he was killed, making history even worse. Realizing this, Dan and Deborah immediately decide to go back to the past once again to save Chris. On the 24th of April, 1765, Chris follows his plan and gathers the townspeople, trying to motivate them to fight against the British soldiers. But because of his dark skin, the white townspeople refuse to listen to him. At the same time, when John and Samuel ask Paul if they should start the fight, Paul says he cannot think about a rebellion right now because his daughter has been missing since yesterday. He wants to find her first. Because of this, Chris's plan fails again. Just then, Dan and Deborah return. Chris is shocked and asks why they came back. He had told them to leave. Dan shows Chris a photo of his statue from the future and explains that things became even worse later on. That is why they had to come back. Now they clearly need a new plan. The three of them sit together and think about how to start a fight between the British and the townspeople. Dan comes up with an idea. He says they don't need a big reason, just one target. If they tell the British about the town's hidden weapons, the British will come to take them, and the townspeople will fight to protect them. This will start the American Revolution. Chris and Deborah agree. According to the plan, Deborah will tell the townspeople that British soldiers are coming the next morning to steal their weapons. At the same time, Dan and Chris will go to the British camp and convince them to raid the weapons the next morning. While traveling to the British camp, Dan tells Chris about his father. His father was a great scientist who created the theory for a time machine but never finished it. Dan spent his childhood in labs and finally completed the time machine himself, fulfilling his father's dream. But now, because of time travel, history keeps changing, and the future is always in danger. Dan and Chris reach the British camp and meet their leader, Smith. Dan lies and says they are British spies. He tells Smith that the people of Lexington are hiding a large stock of weapons and suggests raiding the town the next morning. At first, Smith does not trust them, but a soldier named Davy supports them. Since Chris knows British history well, he talks to Davy about Old Britain, convincing him that they are truly British. Chris even becomes friends with Davy. Meanwhile, Deborah completes her part of the plan. She tells the townspeople to gather near the weapons factory the next morning. The next day, everything happens as planned. The townspeople, led by John, Samuel, and Paul, arrive with their weapons to protect the factory. The British army also arrives, ready to take the weapons. Dan, Chris, and Deborah stand aside, waiting for the fight to begin. At first, both sides start talking instead of fighting. To force the clash, Dan and Chris fire a shot from far away. Both sides think the battle has started and begin shooting at each other. Dan and Chris are happy. Their plan has worked. The American Revolution has finally begun. Dan says they can now return to 2025, but suddenly they see that the British soldiers are winning. The townspeople start dying one by one. Deborah says she cannot watch her people die and wants to fight. Dan stops her and says he has a plan to end the battle at once. Dan tells the townspeople to move away from the weapons factory, so the British think they have run away in fear. At first, John and Samuel hesitate, but Dan convinces them to trust him. They finally pull back. Then Chris tells the British leader that the townspeople have surrendered and that they can safely enter the factory to take the weapons. Inside, Chris feels sad because he knows his friend Davy is also going in and will die. As soon as the British soldiers enter the factory, Dan, Chris, and Deborah fire a shell from a distance. The factory explodes because it is full of ammunition, killing all the British soldiers. Chris cries, realizing that Davy is dead too, but he understands that this sacrifice was needed to protect the future. The townspeople gather and thank Dan, Chris, and Deborah for saving the town. Dan gives all the credit to Paul because history books mention Paul's name, and this helps keep history the same. In return, Dan asks Paul for permission to take Deborah with him. Since they saved the town, Paul agrees happily. Still, no one knows that Dan and Chris are from the future or that Deborah is about to travel there with them. All three of them return to the year 2025, and this time everything is finally back to normal. The world is safe again. History has been fixed. Deborah is happy too because now she finally gets to live in the future and experience this new world. As the days slowly pass, Deborah begins to understand this time while living with Dan. She carefully watches how people live, how they work, and how society functions. Many things surprise her, and some even scare her. For example, when she sees an airplane flying in the sky for the first time, she thinks it is some strange new creature. Dan patiently explains everything to her, step by step, so she does not feel confused or look strange among people of this time. Deborah is amazed to see that people no longer need to hunt just to eat. No one dies from hunger anymore. She is also surprised that women are free to work, earn money, and make their own choices. Seeing all this inspires Deborah. She decides that she too will think of an idea and start working on her own, just like women in this era. But after only a few days, Deborah discovers a painful truth. In the past, whenever Dan came to meet her, he used to sing songs for her and say that he had written them just for her. Now, in 2025, Deborah realizes that those songs were never his. She also finds out that the stories Dan told her as his own were actually taken from the Harry Potter movies. In the past, Deborah had no way of knowing this, so she had been impressed by Dan. But now, living in the present, the truth slowly becomes clear. Deborah feels hurt and angry. She thinks the man she trusted turned out to be dishonest. Dan explains that he never meant to cheat her. He only wanted to see her happy. He tells her that he was even ready to give his life for her in the 18th century. After hearing this, Deborah finally forgives him. She understands that Dan lied not out of bad intentions, but because he was scared of losing her. After this, Dan and Deborah start thinking about the time machine again. They wonder, why not use it to change bad events in history and make the world better? At the same time, their third friend, Chris, has not been meeting them for many days. So Dan goes to see Chris at the university and asks why he has been avoiding them since they returned from the past. Dan tells Chris that he and Deborah want to go back in time again and fix big historical events to improve the future. It would also be an experiment to see if time travel can truly be used to help the world. Chris listens, but then explains why he has been staying away. During their last trip, he almost lost his life. He is also deeply troubled because Davy died because of him. Davy was a good man and had become his friend. Since then, Chris has been full of guilt. That guilt made him lock himself inside his house for weeks after returning to the present. Dan then suggests an idea. If Chris feels guilty about Davy's death, Why not save millions of lives instead? That might help him feel better. Dan suggests going back to World War II and killing Adolf Hitler before the war even begins, which could save millions of people. Chris finds the idea tempting. They try it, but when Dan and Chris time travel to Berlin in 1937, Hitler's guards quickly notice them and start chasing them to kill them. Realizing they are about to be caught, Dan and Chris escape back into the time bag and return to the present just in time. Back at Chris's house, all three sit together and talk about what to do next. Chris strongly says that changing the past is wrong. Humans should not play with time and space. Dan already changed history once, and they had to risk their lives to fix it. Chris believes the time machine should be destroyed forever. Dan and Deborah are already together now, so they should simply live a normal, happy life. But Dan and Deborah do not agree. Deborah believes that the power to travel through time is like a blessing. With it, they could help people, stop suffering, prevent hunger, and save many lives. Dan suggests a safer approach. Instead of changing big events, they should try a small experiment. Make a very tiny change in the past and see how much it affects the future. Because Chris is still deeply affected by Davy's death, they decide to travel to the year 1998. Dan explains their plan clearly. They will have two missions. First, Chris will save a school teacher named Amy, who died in a road accident when Dan was a child. This time, Chris will save her life. Doing this will help Chris feel better, because after losing Davy, he will finally have saved someone. After that, they will return to the future and check what changes happened because Amy survived. If this experiment works, they might be able to save many people who died in similar accidents. At the same time, Dan has a personal reason to go back. In 1998, when he was a child, some boys used to bully him for no reason at all. So while Chris focuses on saving teacher Amy, Dan plans to finally face those boys and take revenge for his painful childhood. All three of them carefully travel back to the year 1998 using the time bag. As soon as they arrive, they change into clothes from that time so they look normal and do not stand out. Dan then takes Chris and Deborah to a famous ice cream parlor that was very popular in the 1990s but later shut down in the original timeline. Since they are already here, they decide to enjoy the ice cream one last time. Deborah is extremely excited. She went directly from the 18th century to 2025, and now she is jumping across different time periods, seeing worlds she could never even imagine. Everything feels magical and new to her. Soon after, Chris leaves Dan and Deborah at the ice cream parlor and goes to carry out his mission, saving Amy, the teacher. Meanwhile, Dan and Deborah enjoy many flavors of ice cream. While sitting there, Dan suddenly notices the same boys who used to beat him during his childhood for no reason at all. Seeing them brings back painful memories. Dan decides that today, at least once, he will stand up for his younger self and teach those boys a lesson. At the same time, Chris reaches the town square. From future news records, he already knows that the accident is going to happen any minute. He sees Amy walking toward the road, busy reading messages on her pager and not paying attention. Just before the car hits her, Chris runs forward and pulls her away, saving her life. Once again, the past has been changed. Chris feels relief. Ever since Davy died because of him, he had been living with guilt. Saving Amy makes him feel that he has finally done something right. Back at the ice cream parlor, Deborah happily tries many flavors. She secretly knows that in the original future, this shop will close within 2 years. So she talks to the shop owner, Chloe, and gently encourages her not to give up. Deborah tells her that even if the business is struggling now, it will become successful and famous in the future if she keeps going. Chloe is shocked. She wonders how this young woman knows her problems. But Deborah sounds honest and kind, so Chloe decides not to close the shop after all. By this time, Chris returns and tells them that everything went as planned and Amy is safe. He feels lighter and happier. Now only one task remains: Dan confronting the boys who bullied him as a child. Dan remembers how, when he was young, some adults watched him being beaten and did nothing, even when he asked for help. Filled with anger, Dan walks up to the boys and warns them that they cannot treat people like this. He then scares them badly and chases them away from the ice cream parlor. People around are shocked to see a grown man yelling at kids, so Dan lies and says he is their uncle and is punishing them for skipping school and playing games. Now all three feel satisfied. Chris saved Amy. Dan stood up for his younger self. Deborah saved the ice cream shop. Chloe thanks them sincerely. She explains that making ice cream was always her dream, but poor business almost made her quit. After meeting Deborah, she found hope again and decides to keep the shop running herself. The three walk out happily. Now all that remains is to return to 2025 and see how these small changes affected the future. If this experiment works, they believe they can keep traveling through time and saving people again and again. But just as they take out the time bag to return, something shocking happens. Dan suddenly sees his younger self. The same boys whom future Dan scared earlier are now grabbing young Dan. The boys say that earlier, a grown man came, beat them, and even mentioned Dan's name. So now they are taking revenge on the younger Dan. Future Dan is completely shaken. He realizes something terrible. He never changed his past at all. In fact, those boys bullied him because his future self traveled back in time and attacked them. This creates a time paradox. Dan was bullied only because of his own future actions. Now everything makes sense. That is why the boys hurt him without any clear reason. When future Dan tries to run forward to save his younger self, he suddenly hits an invisible wall and cannot move. Chris explains that the universe may not allow two versions of the same person to touch or interact directly. Dan is forced to watch himself being beaten. Suddenly, he remembers something important. When he was young, the adults who stood far away and did nothing were actually his future selves, unable to interfere. Everything had already happened exactly this way. Dan realizes the painful truth. He never changed the past. Instead, he was the reason his childhood was so difficult. Chris and Deborah comfort him and suggest that maybe this suffering is what made Dan lonely, pushed him towards science, helped him build the time machine, and eventually led him to Deborah. If his childhood had been happy, none of this might have happened. At least now Dan feels some peace. He knows the bullying was not random, and at least once he stood up to those boys. With this realization, all three return to 2025 again. This time, they see clear changes in the future. The ice cream parlor that once shut down is now still open and very famous. Suddenly, Chloe sees Deborah and is shocked. Deborah looks exactly the same as she did 27 years ago. Chloe walks toward her, but suddenly a car hits Chloe. The driver is revealed to be Amy, the teacher Chris saved in 1998. Because of that single change, Chloe dies, Amy goes to prison, and Amy also recognizes Chris, screaming because he looks exactly the same as before. Everything goes wrong again. Finally, the three understand the truth. They should never change the past. Even a tiny change can destroy lives in unexpected ways. No matter how good their intentions are, something always breaks. They decide they must go back to 1998 and restore everything exactly as it was, except for one event, Dan's bullying. That event must stay, because it is what leads Dan to create the time machine. From now on, they promise never to change history again. Instead, they decide to use the time machine only to earn money, by knowing outcomes in advance and placing bets to become rich. Dan, Deborah, and Chris were extremely happy because they now had a working time machine that could take them into the past. Deborah was originally from the 17th century, but after coming to the present, she slowly learned everything about the modern world. After their last trip to the year 1998, she decided that she wanted to do something meaningful for herself. Her dream was simple. She wanted to open her own ice cream parlor, but there was a big problem. Neither Dan nor Chris had any money. Dan had only worked as a lab assistant, and Chris was still at the very beginning of his career. So how could they arrange the money Deborah needed? After thinking together, they came up with a risky idea. Since they had a time machine, why not go back in time and earn money there? With knowledge of future events, they could easily place bets and win large amounts of money. Deborah then shared her wish to visit a time when America was changing and growing, especially the late 19th and early 20th century. That's how they chose the year 1920, a time when powerful mafia gangs ruled many American cities. Their plan was simple. They would place bets in that era, win gold, bring it back to the present, sell it, and become rich. No one in the past would question them because betting and crime were common during that time. After making full preparations, Dan, Deborah, and Chris traveled to the year 1920. They even wore clothes from that era so they wouldn't look suspicious. Chris, who knew history very well, told the other two that they were now in Chicago, a city completely controlled by dangerous gangs back then. He explained that they would pretend to be members of a powerful New York gang, place bets in the evening, and win a huge amount of gold. Dan and Deborah were excited. For the first time in their lives, they would get to act like gangsters, something they could never do in the real world. But things didn't go as planned. When evening came and they entered a nearby bar to place their bets, the bartender refused to recognize them. On top of that, gangs from New York were not allowed to operate in Chicago at all. The situation suddenly became dangerous. Thinking quickly, Dan lied. He said they weren't from New York at all. They were from Chicago. He claimed they were members of Al Capone's gang. At that time, Al Capone was the most feared name in Chicago. His gang controlled almost the entire city. The moment the bartender heard Al Capone's name, everything changed. He immediately offered them free drinks and a table. No one dared to question anyone connected to Al Capone. That's why Dan used his name, hoping it would save them. However, Chris suddenly became very scared. This was never part of their original plan. From history, Chris already knew how dangerous Al Capone truly was. If Capone ever found out that three strangers were pretending to be members of his gang, he wouldn't think twice before killing them. But Dan and Deborah were still calm. They believed nothing bad would happen. Their plan was simple: win money tonight and return to the future. They told Chris to relax, stop worrying, and just enjoy the moment. But the time machine couldn't save them from what happened next. Suddenly, Al Capone himself appeared in front of them, pointing a gun straight at them. He said he didn't recognize their faces at all. If they were really part of his gang, why had he never seen them before? And why were they using his name? The situation was extremely dangerous. Out of the three, Chris knew history the best. Thinking fast, he started lying. He said that all three of them were big fans of Al Capone and his gang. They admired him and wanted to work under him. To make his story sound real, Chris even shared some secret details about Capone's childhood, things only a few people knew. He had learned all this from history books. Hearing this, Capone slowly started believing them, but he still wanted to test their loyalty, so he ordered them to come with him immediately on a robbery. The three friends had no choice. If they refused, Capone would shoot them right there. To make things even worse, their bag, containing the time machine, accidentally ended up in Capone's hands. Once again, their time travel plan had completely failed. Now they were trapped in a serious problem, forced to take part in a robbery alongside Al Capone himself. Somehow they managed to complete the robbery and reach Capone's house with him. After seeing how they handled themselves, Capone felt they could be useful. He officially accepted them into his gang. During this time, he placed Dan's time travel bag inside his personal safe, along with all his gold. Only Capone knew the passcode to that safe. Now Dan, Chris, and Deborah were truly stuck. Without the bag, they couldn't return to their own time, the year 2025. For now, they were trapped in the year 1920. To survive, they started living in that time and slowly earned Capone's trust. They helped him win many bets using their future knowledge, the same bets they had originally planned to win for themselves. This worked perfectly. Capone became very impressed and began trusting them fully. Within just 1 week, he made Dan his most important man. But Chris was not happy. He met Dan and Deborah in private, full of anger and frustration. He shouted that every time they tried to fix something, using time travel, everything became worse. From history, Chris knew that Capone would be arrested in the year 1933, but right now it was only 1920. That meant Capone would stay powerful for another 13 years, and they couldn't stay trapped in the past for that long. Chris then came up with a risky plan. He told Dan and Deborah to keep Capone busy and distracted. Meanwhile, Chris would go alone to the government offices and give them all the evidence against Capone. If he could change history and make Capone get arrested in 1920 instead of 1933, all three of them could safely return to their own time. According to the plan, Dan and Deborah stayed close to Capone, while Chris went to the government office. But things went wrong again. Capone soon found out that Chris had gone to the government to expose him. Capone never liked Chris from the start, and now he also began suspecting Dan and Deborah. To test their loyalty, Capone made a terrifying demand. He told Dan and Deborah that they must prove their loyalty by killing their own friend, Chris, right in front of him. With no other choice left, Dan and Deborah agreed. Dan and Deborah quickly went to meet Chris. Chris told them the truth. He had gone to the government office to give evidence against Al Capone, but there was a big problem. All the officers working there were already under Capone's control. Capone had paid them a lot of money and bought their loyalty. After hearing this, Dan and Deborah understood everything. That was how Capone already knew that Chris was trying to trap him. Most likely one of the government officers had sold Chris's name to Capone for money. That was the reason Capone had ordered Dan and Deborah to kill Chris. This also meant that Chris's plan to change the 1933 arrest and make it happen in 1920 had completely failed. Instead of trapping Capone, Chris had trapped himself. Now Capone was actively searching for him to kill him. Seeing Chris so scared, Dan and Deborah finally told him their secret escape plan. They said they would pretend that they had caught Chris and were bringing him to Capone's house to kill him in front of everyone. At the right moment, they would point a gun at Capone, force him to tell them the safe's password, open it, and take back their time bag. Along with that, they would also take all the gold they had looted with Capone and won through betting. Then they would escape to the future. Chris was terrified. The plan was extremely risky, but Dan and Deborah explained that there was no other choice. If they didn't take this risk, they would be stuck in the year 1920 forever. In the end, Chris had no option but to agree. At Capone's house, Deborah stayed with Capone's wife to keep her busy. Meanwhile, Dan brought Chris in front of Capone and acted as if he had completed Capone's order. He loudly said that he was now going to kill Chris right there. Just like they hoped, Capone himself handed his gun to Dan. The moment Dan got the gun, he turned it toward Capone and ordered him to open the safe. Dan and Chris felt relieved. They thought their plan had worked, But suddenly, Capone started laughing. He wasn't scared at all. That's when the truth came out. The gun had no bullets. Capone often tested his gang members like this. He had purposely given Dan an empty gun. In panic, Dan had revealed their entire plan. Now everything had gone wrong. Capone decided to kill all three of them. Chris suddenly remembered that history books mentioned Capone's loyalty test using empty guns, but under pressure, he had forgotten. Capone said he would kill them slowly, one by one. First, he locked Chris inside his safe so he could kill Dan first, since Dan had pointed the gun at him. But Capone didn't know one important thing. Inside the safe was the bag he had taken from Dan, the time machine. Chris used the time bag and traveled straight to the year 2025. By now, Capone's house had turned into a museum. Tourists were shocked to see Chris suddenly appear out of nowhere. Chris quickly grabbed an iron rod and used the time bag again to return to 1920. This time, he appeared outside the safe. Just as Capone was about to kill Dan, Chris hit Capone on the head with the iron rod, injuring him and saving Dan. Capone was stunned. He couldn't understand how Chris escaped the safe or where the weapon came from. At the same moment, Capone's wife heard the noise and rushed inside with a gun. She saw Dan and Chris surrounding her husband and warned them to step back. Suddenly, Deborah returned with a large gun to save her friends. A wild gunfight started. In the end, Dan, Deborah, and Chris managed to overpower both Capone and his wife. According to their plan, they collected all the gold from the safe, the same gold they had looted together and won through bets. Then all three of them entered the time bag and returned to their own time. The year 2025. They had finally become rich. Although things had gone very wrong in the past, they never left each other's side. They decided to sell the gold slowly and live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Deborah was happy because she could finally start her ice cream parlor. Dan and Deborah soon began planning it together. Chris returned to his job at the university, but the university head, Damien, called him for a meeting. Damien said Chris had not been focusing on his work for weeks. If this continued, he would lose his job. Damien also said he believed Chris could become a great historian, but his recent behavior was disappointing. Chris couldn't tell the truth about time travel, so instead he promised Damien that he was working on a special project. He said he would research the history of the 17th century and complete the project successfully. Chris went straight to Dan and asked if he could borrow his time machine for a short time. Dan agreed, but after some time passed, Dan was completely shocked. Chris had actually traveled back to the 17th century and brought two men, John and Samuel, into the future. Chris explained everything. He said he could not risk his entire career just for time travel missions anymore. His job was already in danger. That was why, even though he didn't want to, he used Dan's time machine for himself. His plan was to keep John and Samuel at his house and use their knowledge to complete his 17th century history project. If his research was perfect and real, his senior, Daniel, would not fire him. Since John and Samuel were truly from the 17th century, Chris knew that all the information they gave would be completely real and accurate. Dan was surprised in another way too. John and Samuel were extremely happy after coming to the present time. They were excited to see the future. They also found out that Dan had brought Deborah from the past into the future earlier. This meant that now, not just Dan, Chris and Deborah, but John and Samuel also knew the secret of the time machine. Chris took John and Samuel to his house so he could work on his project for the next week. At the same time, Dan and Deborah sold some of their gold and bought a restaurant. They planned to turn it into an ice cream parlor for Deborah. They started the preparations and even hired a few workers. Deborah was very happy because she was finally doing something of her own. But for Chris, things did not go smoothly. The very next day, Chris left John and Samuel alone at home and went to the university for work. While alone, John and Samuel became scared. They believed that all the machines and modern items in the house were powered by evil forces. Coming from the 17th century, they had never seen such advanced technology before. Out of fear, they started breaking things inside the house. When Chris returned in the evening, he was shocked. Almost everything in his house was destroyed. He became very angry and disappointed. He had believed that keeping John and Samuel with him would help his career, but now he realized that they could not be left alone in this time at all. The next day, Chris asked Dan for advice. Dan suggested a solution. He told Chris to install CCTV cameras and speakers in the house. That way, Chris could watch John and Samuel even while he was at work and talk to them if needed. Chris followed the advice. Whenever John or Samuel tried to touch something dangerous or strange, Chris would speak through the speakers and tell them to stop. John and Samuel were completely confused. They couldn't understand how someone could watch them from so far away. They believed the voice speaking to them was the voice of God. But this solution didn't last long. Soon, the cameras were also destroyed. After that, John and Samuel left Chris's house and somehow reached his university. When Chris saw them there, he was shocked. He wondered how they even found the place. Then he remembered John and Samuel had lived in the same town back in the year 1775. The town had changed, but the roads were still familiar. To avoid trouble, Chris lied to the students and said that John and Samuel were theater artists wearing costumes from an old time period. But Chris's senior, Damien, was not impressed. He scolded Chris again, saying that instead of focusing on his work, he was wasting time on useless distractions. Two strange men had even followed him into his class. This time, Damien lost his patience and finally fired Chris from his job. Chris was devastated. His decision to bring John and Samuel into the future had completely failed. Now he had lost his job as well. Dan tried to cheer him up. He said that they already had plenty of money, so Chris didn't really need a job anymore. But Chris didn't agree. For him, work was just as important as money. He had loved history since childhood. Being a historian was his dream, and he couldn't give it up. Seeing Chris like this, Dan got an idea. He decided that he would help Chris, without telling him anything. After all, Chris had once traveled into the past to help Dan fix his mistakes and even save the world. This time, Dan wanted to do something big for Chris in return. Dan went alone to meet the head of the university, Damien. Dan decided to tell him the full truth. He explained that Professor Chris had actually been traveling through time with him using a time machine for the past several weeks. That was the real reason Chris had not been able to focus properly on his work. Dan also said that Chris was truly talented and deeply dedicated to history, and he asked Damien to give Chris his job back. But Damien did not believe him at all. He thought Dan was joking. He said that in his entire life, he had never heard such a strange and terrible excuse just to save a friend's job. Seeing that Damien didn't believe him, Dan decided to prove the truth. He asked Damien to come with him and see the time machine for himself. Dan placed Damien inside the time bag and started the machine. But the moment the machine activated, Damien, because of his old age, suffered a heart attack and died instantly. Dan was completely shocked. He didn't know what to do anymore. Not only would Chris not get his job back, but now Dan would also be blamed for Damien's death. The worst part was that Chris didn't even know what had happened yet. Dan then made another decision. Since he had a time machine, he thought he could fix this mistake. He traveled 1 hour into the past and warned Damien about his future death. But as soon as Damien heard this, he again suffered a heart attack and died. Dan tried again. This time he traveled 1 full day into the past. He showed Damien his own future dead body and warned him again to never use the time machine. But seeing his own corpse was too much for Damien. He collapsed and died once more. Dan kept traveling back in time again and again, trying desperately to save Damien's life. But every single time, the result was the same. Damien always died. It was as if his death was fixed in this timeline, something that could not be changed, no matter what Dan did. Completely exhausted and broken, Dan finally called Chris, Deborah, John, and Samuel and told them the entire truth. When Chris saw multiple versions of Damien's dead body, he was horrified. He broke down in tears. Damien was not just his senior, he was his mentor. He was the man who inspired Chris to become a historian. And now, because of Dan's actions, Damien had died again and again. Dan explained everything. He said that even after many attempts, he could not change Damien's fate. Maybe Damien's death at this moment in time was unavoidable. Chris understood that Dan had done all of this for him, but now they faced a new and dangerous problem. What would they do with all these bodies? If anyone discovered them, the secret of the time machine would be revealed to the entire world. That's when Deborah came up with an idea. She suggested taking the bodies back to the 17th century and burying them there. In that era, people died every day because of hunger and disease, so no one would question it. Dan and Chris agreed. One by one, they took each body back to the 17th century and buried them. After the final burial, they returned to the year 2025. That's when Deborah shared some surprising good news. Since Damien himself had fired Chris, his sudden death left the position of university head empty, and for that position, Chris was chosen. In Damien's official records, he had written that he had never seen a historian as brilliant as Chris. Because of this, Chris became the new head of the university. Chris's career had reached the highest point of his life. In the end, John and Samuel also made a decision. After seeing the future, they realized they were not meant to live in this time. They wanted to return to their own era. Dan respected their choice and took them back to the 17th century. After returning, Dan told Chris that it was finally time to be happy. Everything they had ever wanted had come true. They already had plenty of money. Dan had found Deborah and married her. Deborah had started her own business, and Chris had achieved his lifelong dream of becoming the head of the university. All three of them reached their goals by supporting each other. They still had the time machine. And with this happy ending, the entire time travel series comes to an end. So tell us, how did you like this story? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting time travel adventures. Thank you.